Video game titles are usually a good indication of what a certain game will entail, or at the very least get you interested enough to make you want to play the game. A lot of successful franchises have iconic names that are to the point and evoke interest in the player. Grand Theft Auto, you steal cars and shoot people. Halo, you run around on a giant ring. Battlefield, you shoot the piss out of everyone on a giant battlefield. Final Fantasy, well that one's not very good because there's been like 50 Final Fantasy games and there's nothing final about them. The game I'm talking about today has a very interesting name and is also pretty underrated. F.E.A.R. F.E.A.R is a 2005 psychological horror shooter developed by Monolith Productions, known for their work on Condemned, another horror-based and underrated franchise, and the equally terrifying Gotham City Imposters. The early to mid 2000s was definitely a time where FPS games really started to take over. Sure, platformers were still going, but around this time they started to get freaky with it, and kids would rather see a face get blown off by a shotgun than smash crates. Set in the not so distant future of 2025, we take control of Point Man, a member of F.E.A.R, First Encounter Assault Recon Special Forces. These are the guys you call when stars are too busy getting ripped apart in a mansion. F.E.A.R are a military group who handle weird shit the normal military can't handle themselves, and things do indeed get weird when a psychic commander called Paxton Fettel uses his psychic powers to control his army of clones in order to seize intel from a secret bunker located somewhere in Fairport City. Does the story sound a bit weird so far? Well, that's nothing, because there's also paranormal stuff going on too, as throughout the game you realise Fettel may or may not be under the control of a creepy little girl whose mental powers are so strong she can kill anyone with a single thought. Yeah, the story's a little bit of a mess, and it seems like this is a trend for the rest of the series too, as there's DLC for the game that isn't considered canon anymore, and there's apparently 2 different timelines after the first game. F.E.A.R's enjoyment doesn't come from its narrative though. Like many other early to mid 2000s shooters, it's the gameplay that gets you going. It has so many more aspects about it that make it fun, unique, and pretty strange. It's a game that I feel is overlooked despite having some of the most addictive action and interesting mechanics for the time it was released. F.E.A.R is advertised as a psychological horror crossed with a tactical FPS shooter, but if we're using maths, I'd say it's about 20% horror and 80% shooter. The game lacks scares. That doesn't mean it is completely void of scary and unsettling moments, but with a title like F.E.A.R, you expect there to be a little bit more to the scares than what is on display. The horror element of the game feels equivalent to what you would expect to find in one of those scary Halloween festivals you go to, where there's fog machines and underpaid actors running about with hockey masks on.
Oh no, anything but a skeleton.
It may not be perfect, and some of the decisions made by Monolith are questionable, but F.E.A.R's core gameplay is great, and I feel like it deserves a little bit more recognition, even if it is just for the mechanics alone. It would have been easy for Monolith Productions to give the player an uninspired action shooter with constant running, jumping, and shooting. Though this can be entertaining, Monolith knew they needed to create something that would stick out, especially since F.E.A.R was a new IP that didn't have the star factor other shooters like Doom, Quake, and Halo had. Kevin Stevens, the engineering director for Monolith at the time, stated that the team wanted a game that had a lot of action and was based off the action movie experience. When looked at without much thought, this seems like just another simple throwaway explanation for why the game is the way it is, but lazy developers would fall into the trap of making dull mindless action, whereas Monolith clearly had their sights on making something fresher and more interesting. To the untrained mind of someone who does not have a gaming addiction and extreme ADHD, F.E.A.R may just seem like a typical shooter, but its mechanics give what could have been a generic game a lot of personality. Your main objective is to shoot bad guys, but this time these bad guys are clones. The term clone might make you think that these guys are all the same and completely boring, but if the Clone Wars has taught me anything, it's not to paint all clones with the same brush. I am no longer a clone racist. You eventually fight other factions like corrupt cops, mercs, and even little ghouls that run up and scratch you.
What are some of your likes? Ghouls.
But the clones take up most of the enemies you fight. While these guys have no personality whatsoever besides generic military speak,
I need backup!
it's their AI that is most impressive. It's not uncommon for shooters to have AI that react to what's going on around them, like reacting to the environment or reacting to getting shot, but the amount of maneuvers and behavioural changes these guys display is really surprising, especially for 2005. Enemies will actively work out how to take down the player by doing things like flanking, laying down suppressive fire for their comrades, and even jumping through windows to close the gap between themselves and you. Enemies often won't even charge you if they believe you have a line of sight on them, as they will hunker down and try to pick you off from a distance. distance. This behaviour makes each enemy encounter feel unpredictable, and it teaches you very quickly not to underestimate how dangerous these guys are. Rushing them down like Doom Guy will get you killed quicker than a generic faceless soldier, which you are, but that's besides the point. What I'm saying is you have to be tactical about your approach, and Monolith gives you the means to get the job done, despite the odds being heavily stacked in the enemy's favour, what with the clones, invisible ninjas, giant mechs, and ghouls. The combat in the game reminds me a lot of Gears of War, as a lot of the time you will be firing at enemies from behind cover, or rushing them down with a shotgun. This game has a vast range of weapons like machine guns, shotguns, rocket launchers, pistols, laser pointers, you name it. While a lot of these guns are very powerful, they won't always be available to you, meaning you will have to rely on surprising the enemy and standing behind cover. Your health drains rapidly when you get shot. Seriously, you get so much as sneezed on without armour and you're as good as dead. This makes going out in the open very risky, especially if you're planning on rushing down enemies. A nifty mechanic is that you can lean, allowing you to get a cheeky glimpse around a corner, and it can also help you practice for your next cancerous Rainbow Six Siege game. Running and shooting in F.E.A.R is also a gamble. The fully automatic weapons handle very poorly when you just spray them, so short controlled bursts are needed to get the best out of your weapons. These elements make it feel like a tactical shooter, but the next mechanic makes you feel like an action hero. This feature does what it says on the tin. Activating slow-mo will slow down time, obviously, giving you a massive advantage over enemies as you can aim your gun more accurately and are able to shoot and move faster than them, plus it lets you do your best Max Payne impression. Even on normal difficulty, the game can be fairly challenging, as it's easy to get caught up in the moment and get quickly overwhelmed by the amount of bad guys running at you. This is what makes it feel a little different from the other classic shooters at the time, because there's a certain level of enjoyment that comes from carefully and methodically taking down enemies, rather than just rushing them guns blazing. It's a nice change is what I'm trying to say, but that's not to say the gameplay isn't annoying at times. Saving in this game is a ball ache. Sometimes you will get a quick save every 5 minutes, and then other times you won't get one for ages, so if you die without saving, wave goodbye to all that progress, mate. And this happens a lot, especially when the game starts to add the more annoying enemies, like the drones. Fuck the drones. I don't have a problem with many of the other enemies in the game. After all, they spice up the gameplay and force you to adapt in fast-paced situations, but holy shit are the drones annoying. The name, F.E.A.R, creates a certain image in your head. It's a simple title, but one that makes you think you're in for a spooky time. However, like I said in the introduction, that's rarely the case. F.E.A.R's tone is a little all over the place, which is due to many different elements of the game contradicting one another and hurting the overall experience. The opening to the game does a great job at capturing your attention, and is probably the peak of the narrative, which should never be the case. When your strongest element is your introduction, and the rest of the game just falls off, then there's a problem with the story. The opening cutscene paints F.E.A.R out to be a mysterious and dangerous adversary, as it shows off the power he has over his private army, and portrays him almost like a zombie, shown by him eating someone. It's all really weird, and you think it will launch the game into being a weird horror-based shooter, and the first level of this game even supports this idea. Point Man is dropped off into the thick of the situation as the new guy, and for the majority of the level, you are on your own, looking for F.E.A.R, skulking around an abandoned building looking for a freaky cannibal weirdo, all the while hallucinating, getting jump scared, and having eerie music play over the whole thing, made me genuinely excited for the horror aspects later on in the game. But then it's like Monolith Productions forgot they were making a horror game and just focused on action, because the tone starts to get really weird after this point. Instead of action mixed in with a healthy blend of horror, F.E.A.R is just an action game with a scary veil over the front of it. Shit, a spooky little girl following me around. I can tell this one's going to be scary. Oh no, never mind. All of the other scares are shit. As much as I loved the combat of the game, I couldn't help but walking away from F.E.A.R feeling disappointed by how flat the horror elements felt. We all know it's possible to blend action and horror together. Companies like Capcom have been doing it for years, and Monolith themselves even achieved it with their Condemned series, but it feels like this game is trying to mislead you in thinking that it's going to have elements of horror, but it rarely ever crosses that line. The expansions feel like they delve a little deeper into the horror element of the game, but what's funny is Monolith didn't even develop them. They got someone else to do it for them. F.E.A.R would have worked better if it just binned off the horror elements, because to be honest, they aren't necessary to the overall enjoyment of the game. In fact, I think they even ruin it a little. The horror of F.E.A.R leaves a lot to be desired. Monolith made it clear that they didn't set out to make a traditional horror experience. The goal was to make a game that creeped you out. How do you make a creepy game? Well, basically you take a weird little girl, disintegrating hallucinations, ghouls, and who can forget, PNG jump scares. Though Monolith Productions set out to make a uniquely creepy experience, they ended up producing one of the most predictable ones instead, and that's a real shame. Horror goes with action so well when a developer nails it, and the outcome is often amazing. The horror in F.E.A.R never develops beyond a concept. The game claims that what you are seeing and experiencing is scary, but most of the time you just react with, well, that was a bit weird. If you find most of F.E.A.R scary, then you probably eat at Weenie Hut Juniors. I say most because there is a part in Perseus Mandate that got a genuine scare out of me. Sometimes the game will forget it's even got a hint of horror within it, as it just becomes a full-on action game for like an hour and a half. It's like Monolith just wanted to ignore the problem rather than fix it. Hey, we've gone ages without doing anything scary. Fuck it, the player will forget it's a psychological horror game anyway. Another aspect of the game that I feel is wasted is the soundtrack. A lot of the tracks in the game are heavily inspired by the horror genre, but the problem is they feel out of place in a lot of the levels they are a part of. Many of the tracks create a sense of tension and dread. What's around this corner? Maybe some spooky shit? Oh no, it's just some more drones. False alarm, guys. The soundtrack has a lot of high points, but it feels like a waste having so many spooky and ominous tracks in a game where 90% of the time you aren't unsettled, but rather getting ready for a shootout. It would be like playing some upbeat music over Ghost's death or Maria's death. It just doesn't suit what's actually happening on screen. Some of the music is just downright terrible as well. Hey, we need some music for a psychological horror shooter. Say less, my friend. I've got a perfect song for that kind of game. What's happening on screen versus what the developers are trying to convey are often at odds with each other, which kills any interest in the world and story. F.E.A.R's story as a whole is just dull. It's not uncommon for action games to put the story on the back burner to focus on the gameplay, but the developers themselves said they wanted to make an interesting story for the player to get invested in.
This team has always been very focused on trying to tell a good story with the game. We try to not just make it about going around and shooting bad guys who are popping out of every corner. There is
and this seems like an impossible task with confusing plot threads, lack of context, and weak/annoying characters. No one in this game strikes you as being particularly interesting, and most of them come across as unlikable sarcastic arseholes. A lot of characters are introduced, then quickly dismissed, either by being killed or just by being made redundant in the plot, and yet for some reason this fat prick is the one that holds the most relevance in the story. Don't think I've ever wanted to kill an NPC more in my life.
Christ, I thought I was a goner.
It's not even just that the story is a bit boring, it's the fact that it feels so pretentious. The game pulls twists out of its arse that the devs thought would make you go, holy shit, this is the greatest story ever made in gaming. Who needs cinema when you've got F.E.A.R? Story doesn't seem to matter in this franchise anyway. As I said, the DLC for this game is no longer canon, and there's two different timelines. There should have come a point where Monolith made one of two choices: either tone down the action and make the game scarier, or make the story more engaging and bin off the horror elements. I feel like if they had focused on one of these things, the game's overall quality would have improved drastically, or at least make it more memorable. F.E.A.R is a game that gets carried by its gameplay. There's no shame in that. Many games are carried by their gameplay. But if, like me, you came across this game thinking it would be another scary shooter, then you will leave feeling a little disappointed. But the hard work that went into making the AI enemies so interesting to fight cannot be ignored. This feature partnered with the combat makes it fun at least. F.E.A.R is not a bad game by any means, but for someone who loves horror, and seeing that this game is marketed as a psychological horror, I feel like I've been cooked. I'll eventually check out the other F.E.A.R games, but I swear to God, if I see that fat ginger twat again, I'll go mental with a gun.
Destroy this facility.